Okay, I'm back, part two. What I want to do with this one is just kind of break down a track. I did a bootleg recently of Clean Bandit solo, like the original, and I just fancied doing a bootleg, but I did it specifically knowing I was going to do some of these videos. So I set myself the task of trying not to use anything particularly clever or fancy or expensive plugins or expensive synths, really just as an insight into the fact that you can create a good remix without fancy tools. Because I think one of the big mistakes I made for a long time was thinking, if only I had that plugin, or if I had that synth, or if I had that, then my stuff would sound how I wanted to. And it really isn't. I think it's just about good sound selection, good melody ideas. That's already been done for me with the track. So yeah, I'm just really kind of selecting sounds. So I've just gone for samples, and sort of the idea of this is to show you how I made this track. I won't be going too in depth. What I'm going to try and do is make a track from scratch, so you can kind of go through the pain and suffering with me. But for now, I just want to give you an idea that really all you're doing, moving on from doing the DJ mix, if you've done that and you've watched that tutorial, is you're just mixing lots of tracks. It just happens that some of them are bass sounds, some of them are drum loops, some of them are hi-hats, and you're just layering them on top. But there's nothing overtly complex about this particular remix. So if you've heard it or played it out and you like it, you can kind of see what I did here. I was trying to do something a little bit different, trying to avoid using the old house piano and the M1 organ where possible. I think everyone else is doing that, so yeah, let's do something else. So just to kind of give you a rough idea of where I started, the first thing I did was I got the original, and I did what we talked about before, which is I loaded it up, I figured out the tempo, I found the start point, I got it in time, and once I'd done that, I then sped the project up, because the original was 105 BPM and I wanted to do this mix at 123 for when I'm DJing. So I'm just going to pick this section here, which is the chorus, I think. So we've got that, and I was really lucky actually, someone found or had the a cappella. So I did the same, lined the a cappella up, timed it in, and lined it up. So now I've got the a cappella playing here. And it's not great, but it's good enough to work with. Sometimes you can't, and I'll maybe try and do a tutorial about what I do with that. But in this case I did, and what I needed to do was, you need to figure out the chords. And the way I tend to do that, and I'm not a skilled pianist, anyone who knows me will tell you that, I basically try and work out what the bass notes are. So I'll listen to it and literally I'll just try and hit on the keyboard. Let me mute those out. So, and I will maybe just take each section one at a time. So I'll go like this. So that sounds right. So that's the B. And then I'll do the next one. So it's on the A, and then do the next one, F sharp, and then the G. So now I've got the bass notes. So now I've got to figure out the chords. Well, I know it's the B's, so you can just listen to it really. And so you've got the B, it's B minor. So those are the chords. Now obviously I've done that before, so I look like I really know what I'm doing, but that'll take me a little while to do. I'm not that fast at it, but I know people who are really good at it. An incredible musical training. If you're starting out, go get piano lessons. I swear to God, I wish I'd done it years ago. So now I've got those chords and I can play them in, and I recorded them in, so they're there and you can see them in MIDI. I was saying about MIDI before. And that's basically just triggering notes on a very basic piano, which literally I went into instruments, I typed in piano, and I found this piano called Grand Piano, which is that one there. So nothing clever about that, there's no effects on it. So now I know my chords. Then what I was trying to decide to do was how to approach the bass line, because I'll always look at the bass line next. And in the end, I was listening to original, and I just really like the kind of the way the bass line is hitting. It's kind of dum, 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 that sort of sound, that dum 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 dum. And I thought, do you know what? Like, rather than I tried a few ideas, and I thought, rather than do that, why don't I just build it around that? So what I did was I found myself a kick, which is here, as you can see. Then I found myself a drum loop. And actually this drum loop, I don't know if, no, I've stripped it. It had lots of little hi-hats around it, and all I did was I just zoomed in and I just cut out and deleted the bits I didn't want it till you can actually see the end of one of the kind of hat things there. But I basically just cut out the bit I wanted, which was the snare and the hat, so I got left with this. And that's it. No effects on there. That's literally just a nice kick that I liked, and a nice hat and snare from a loop, which might have been from Vengeance. I got a few Vengeance packs. And then once I did that, I wanted a bass, so I found, and again, there's a thing called a simpler, which is a very basic synthesizer, and I found this bass in a Vengeance loop, which sounds like this. If I take the side chain off, sounds like this. And I kind of liked it, and I messed around with it a little bit. I basically did a little thing with the glide here, so that you can hear when I play it, it does that bending sound, which is basically just in the controls. You can set the glide to portamento and how long you want it to take to glide from, to glide from one place to the next. And I just had that sound, which sounds like this. Okay, nothing that clever. I put a little bit of reverb on it because I want it to sound a little bit kind of that sort of roomy vibe. And then I put kickstart on it, which is just a sidechain effect. It's about 10 quid or something. And it basically, what it does, is very important in dance music, is it ducks out the bass sound and lets the kick have space. So at the moment you can hear it all sounds a bit messy, because the frequencies in the kick and the frequencies in the bass are all blending together because they're in the same space. So when you put the sidechain on, you can hear it basically ducks. It's ducking the bass anywhere the kick is playing. It's set to a quarter beat rhythm, so it's just hitting wherever the kick plays. But then I like that bass, but I wasn't that happy, so I then loaded in another sound and I added this, which was basically the full sound was this. I didn't want all of that. I just wanted this, that kind of bitey bit, because it kind of gives it a bit of just gives it a bit of punch, because the bass sounded a bit fluffy. So you can hear without it, and with it, it's got a bit of bite. Now I still wasn't happy. It felt a bit boring, so I added this bass, which again is just another sample, but I added a distortion on it, and more distortion, and a reverb, and the sidechain. So again, nothing that, just some distortion, which is pretty standard. The sidechain, obviously, I've explained that. Reverb, explained that, and then I EQ'd it a bit. So basically, I wanted this sort of middle piece here to create, just gave it a bit of attitude, just so it sounded a little bit interesting. But then that was kind of my bass set. So if I had the vocal back in, but I'm broken hearted, but I like to party. So you kind of got your vibe going on there. I added a crash. Again, it's just nothing fancy about that. And then down here I actually added this bass layer. Again, this was a lot later on because I still wasn't quite happy. And this kind of, I don't know if you can hear that, I'll slow it. Sounds really a bit rubbish on its own. And it's actually playing a syncopated rhythm against the bass. So where the original bass was going dum dum dum, this one is going dum 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 dum. So you kind of get a slightly, if you hear, it sounds a bit odd, but when you add it in with the kick and the snare, you kind of get this bouncy thing going on. But I was still a bit sort of wasn't sort of interesting enough for me. I was determined not to add, you know, at this point you could have added the old house piano, you know, and sound like everyone else, but I didn't want to. So what I did was I started finding little sounds, and again they're just little samples. So this was just like a little bit of a reverse bass sound that leads into the bass. So you kind of get this. So you kind of, rather than it just go dum, it goes vroom, you get a little bass. Then I found this little rave stab that I put in, and I doubled it up. And again, these are all just from sample packs, you know, nothing done to them really. And then I just went looking for like little weird sounds that might sort of, what I wanted to do was I wanted to put a different sound on every sort of part of the sort of bass movement, so you end up getting this feeling of lots happening when they're really, the bass is just doing its thing and you've got this little sound. So I found this, I don't know what this is, it was a weird, there's a clap sound, so that was more of a sort of a drum sound. I found this great gun sound which I cut up, which I love. It's very childish, I know, but there we go. And then there was this like little vocal sound, which again you don't really hear all of it, but in the mix you start seeing that each one of those things has a little feature and suddenly makes it a bit more interesting. So you get the synth stab, the vocal, the gun, the clap, the reverse bass, and you'll see what happens. So now it feels like there's something happening. Now then what I did was I added an extra hi-hat loop. Again, just a standard loop. It's a little bit more shuffly, a bit looser, but it just adds a bit of lift here. And then I felt like this second section needed a lift as well, so I added this. Again, it was a stab sound that I found, Vengeance, I can see it says Vengeance. And I just layered that over the first two hits of each bass sound, so you kind of, it's subtle, but it just makes it feel a bit different. So there was that. There's a drum fill here, which is a combination of a reverse effect, and then there's a reverbed sort of snarey clap, and then a little drum fill. Oh no, it's another reverse effect, so it's kind of going shh, so it sort of get this sucking and pulling feeling. So you hear it kind of goes. But when you put that in, it kind of gives it a nice. So it kind of gives that push and pull. And then there's I put a little harp in here, which I quite like. And again, sometimes a nice thing to do is when you've got chords moving is to play something that just stays the same, and it gives it this nice sort of melodic feeling. And that was about it really. So that was the chorus. The breakdown, I just took the drums and the bass out. I made these pads, which again was I can't remember what this was. It was just silent, just a pad. And then I found this, which I quite like, which is sort of a just had a bit of weight really to give it a bit of sort of and then I added a drone to get that bass, you see. So because I found on its own that just sounded way too thin. That was nice, but again I wanted to kind of put some low end in there, and that was my breakdown added with this serum sound that I found, which I quite like. And what I did was in the automation, I can find it, yeah, I just changed the LFO rate, so it's just how quickly it's enveloping. So that was the breakdown. Classic, you know, snare, long sweep up, just building up to give it energy. And then what was this? Oh, just a snare. Yeah, so I just found a snare and just cut it up and looped it up, and I put this tonal riser underneath to give it some energy. Doing that again, nothing that clever, do you know what I mean? Really simple, literally just, you know, a snare, and it's just looping and building up and building up and building up until it gets to its sort of frantic, and this is pitching up together. And oh yeah, and there you go, there's a snare fill. I knew there was one in there, just that little snare fill there. So what you end up with is this. The only other thing I did was on the master, I used a couple of effects. Again, standard DJ effects, a filter and a reverb, which I'm sure all DJs use out there. And basically the filter is just cutting all the low end out to make it sound thinner, and the reverb is washing it out to give it that big roomy boomy effect, which you can hear building up here. And basically it builds up and up and up until it cuts out. And I just repeated that each time I did the break. And then, yeah, I mean, if I close all of these, in terms of the layout, again, let's mute that. Don't need that. You can see I've just got some drum intro here. You know, I bring in a few little effects, so you kind of a little bit of bass, start bringing in a vocal here, into the first verse, into the breakdown, into the chorus, into the second verse, breakdown, second chorus, little middle eight here, which I actually, funny enough, just chopped the original out. I added my own stuff back in, but I don't know, there's something quite nice about what was going on in there. That's on loop, that won't work. You don't really notice it switching between, but I don't know why I did that. It's not essential, it's just what I did at the time. And it drops into the final chorus and then some drum out, and that is really it. I mean, that's a quick run through. The idea being that if you want to start playing around, don't be frightened by the idea that it has to be really complicated. You know, just start, work out the chords, get a kick, a snare and a hi-hat, you know, and start working out. Especially with dance music, if the bass line, I think if the bass line is right, everything will follow. You know, and I think this one turned out all right. You know, I could have used, loads of toys and tools and made it all complicated, but hopefully this shows that with a few samples, you know, nothing clever, you can make a nice little remix, you know, that will do the job. So I think that is all for now. I'm going to leave it. Cheers.